Hi everyone, it's Sandra. Well, we let some fresh butternut squash get away on us in the fridge and it's really moldy. I've also got some moldy spent coffee grounds, and normally I would not be concerned at all about putting those in my worm bin. However, I've also just come through having a virus and I've got some used tissues and I'm like, mold, used tissues, probably from a virus. I'm going to look into the research and I'm going to see what it says. But what happens when you put pathogens like mold and viruses and even bacteria into a worm bin? What comes out the other side? What are the risks to you handling the material and eventually to your garden and to the worms themselves? Okay, stay tuned. I've got a bin that needs feeding. Okay, so I'm out here with Eat My Shorts. The last time I used Eat My Shorts to demonstrate the different types of food you can give a bin if you run out of conventional food scraps. And I will put a link to that video in the description. But in this corner, I believe we fed those shredded tamale wrappers. We fed some fresh endive stems from my garden. And I topped it up with some of our semi-processed compost, which of course would introduce more chunky bits into this bin. You see the worms are working their way through the brown grocery bag that was on the top here. And it looks like I have also turned over a couple of rotten, oh, there's my pill bug army, a couple of rotten avocados here. Yeah, I think we brought those out the other day. Haven't really attracted a crowd yet. There's the avocado pit. Ooh, looks like I'm going to get an avocado tree out of that one. Yeah, sometimes avocados go bad on you. There's the pill bug in there doing its thing. That's great. And what am I growing here? It's also an interesting thing. All right, so let's turn over this feeding zone and I will talk to you about molds, bacteria, and viruses in your worm bin. Now, molds are, part of the decomposition that happens naturally in the forest. That's why forests kind of smell a little bit moldy. Sometimes you'll get that lovely smell wafting up from leaves as they decompose because it's a very fungal process. Fungi thrive in these cold composting conditions, and so you will often find mushrooms growing in a worm bin. You may even find slime molds growing in a worm bin. Dog vomit slime mold is something that AV had once. I would be so impressed if I ever got it in a bin. So anyway, so molds thrive naturally in a bin, and you actually, want to promote the presence of mold in your worm bin. You don't have to do anything to promote bacteria. They're going to be there anyway. But promoting mold is actually really healthy for your worm bin. And so anything you can do, the addition of wood chips and things like that, the maintenance of good aerobic conditions, so not letting things run away on you into anaerobic conditions, is all very good to maintain a healthy mold in your bin. And you've seen me add many times moldy food to a worm bin, and the worms love it. The worms love getting into mold. There is no problem at all. But, I did talk about it when I talked about my using flour waste as bedding. We're getting into the feeding zone now. I talked about, well, what things on that end of the spectrum, the mold, fungi end of the spectrum, what things there might be deleterious in a worm bin. And the research actually showed that mildew, so powdery mildew, will persist in the vermicompost. It's one of the things that this cold vermicomposting process will not break down. And so if you put, for instance, a lot of your garden waste into your worm bin that had powdery mildew on it, and then used the vermicompost in your next garden, you may pass that on to subsequent generations of your plants. So that is something that, you certainly would be aware of if you have that problem in your garden and you're trying to get rid of it, well, don't put that mildew in your worm bins, and hopefully you can stop the intergenerational transfer to your next year's garden. Just look how black this vermicompost is. It's absolutely amazing. So this is where the tamale were. Let's see if the worms have gotten through them. Oh, I think these are the endive flowers that I'm seeing. Maybe. Wow. Okay, let's dig over. I think the tamale were in the very, very corner here. So with molds, even the deleterious molds, what the worm research says is that there's a lot of competition in a worm bin from all the different sources of fungi in a worm bin. And there's only so much room for each of those fungi to take hold. These must be the endive stems. They're going to take a while to break down, but they haven't gone like rose stems. They're not firm, so I think they will disappear with this feeding. Look at the beautiful black vermicompost that's building. Anyways, don't worry about adding small amounts of mildew. You don't want to overwhelm your bin with powdery mildew, but you certainly don't have to examine every leaf and stem that you put in here to say, oh, could there be powdery mildew on it? Simply not going to be a factor, because the different fungi that are in the bin will outcompete each other. And so if you've got a healthy bin, there's going to be a balance. Nature's going to find a balance there with the fungi, and the mildew will not be passed on, certainly not in high quantity. These are just chunky bits I'm pulling over here. So let's get on to bacteria, and that's probably the easiest one to deal with. Now, this is the old biology teacher in me coming around. Bacteria are living organisms. They persist on a surface. So bacteria would continue to live in this environment unless they are actively killed. And they would live in here because it's moist. It's freezing temperatures don't kill bacteria. A microbiologist told me once that they found bacteria moving even at like minus 80 degrees Celsius, meaning they're definitely still alive. You warm them up, they're gonna bounce back to life. And I think they've even found bacteria under, in glaciers and everything, and rejuvenated them. So bacteria are not going to be killed unless something actively kills them, and temperature is not going to do that. The bacteria I'm talking about here are bacteria that might be deleterious to us, something like E. coli, which is often found in fecal matter, something like salmonella, something like, what's another bacteria? Staphylococcus, staph infection. Those types of bacteria can be harmful to humans. And so what happens when you put them in a worm bin? Well, the good news, folks, is that worms have that silemic fluid in them. Remember Eisenia fetida, if you've ever smelled something really rank coming out of the worm, not anaerobic conditions, but the worms themselves. I think Jane from Rockin' Worms called it a bubbling kind of fluid that comes out of the worms, and it smells. That's where they get their name from, that fluid. The original worm researcher that discovered them or named them must have really ticked them off to get a lot of that bubbling. I have never seen it. Anyway, that fluid that's inside the worms actually kills bacteria, as does the action of the gut of the worm, as does the competition that I talked to you about with regard to fungi. It actually works with bacteria as well. So bacteria, by and large, are not passed along to the subsequent generation of vermicompost and would not be passed along to your garden. Now, I have a caveat with that, and that is if you were to put into your bin something infested with one of those bacterium that is potentially harmful to somebody handling it barehanded like this, or you know, if you took a handful of this vermicompost and put it on an edible crop and it had something like strep or staphylococcus in it or E. coli, you know, what is the potential there if this material was not thoroughly processed? Now, obviously, the thermophilic composting that happens in a conventional system, well, that takes care of the bacteria because heat does kill bacteria. Cold doesn't, but heat does. But this is not hot. So you need that action of the worm. And the researcher says it takes 2 to 3 months for the worms to fully deactivate the bacteria. They did say there's a small chance that E. coli, which is the one that you would get from, you know, unclean handling after you go to the bathroom, E. coli could persist in a worm bin beyond the 2 to 3 months if it was present in the bin in sufficient number. So that would be my one caution there, is introducing E. coli into a worm bin would need an extended period of time. And if you are into that, then please do your research about how long it would take. But generally speaking, worms deactivate bacteria. Viruses, unlike bacteria and molds, are not alive. Viruses is viable, is the term that is used in the biology world to say that is the virus still able to infect a subsequent host? A virus needs a host in order to live. Well, not to live, but to propagate, to reproduce itself. And so without that host, it cannot reproduce. So what happens is viruses, once they are outside of their host, so once they are onto a tissue, they immediately are on a timeline of losing their viability. And they need moisture, they need a suitable temperature, and they need a short enough time span in order for the transfer to a new host to take place. So when you look at viruses that could be on a used tissue, you know, I mean, these have been drying for like 10 days since I was sick. So the dryness is there, you know, there's absolutely no way these viruses can remain viable for this long. The time period from transfer to transfer has to be fairly short. In COVID times, you know, they did some research and they were talking about 72 hours for potentially transmission taking place. It would have to be ideal conditions. There would have to be moisture and there would have to be other things present in order for the virus to remain transmissible over that period of time. So I'm not afraid of any virus that was on these tissues being passed along to anybody who might handle this vermicompost or my future gardens. Now, what about the tissues themselves? Well, so I looked that up. Well, and could they be harmful to the worm or the garden? Well, tissues have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 170 to 200 to 1. So they are a great source of carbon because of their very thin nature. The edges are very thin. They are pretty readily available to carbon. And anyone who's put like napkins from their dinner table or tissues in a bin, I doubt you've ever found them the next time you've gone into a bin. Like, they go pretty darn quickly. However, the research did mention that if tissues are clumped, like they might be if you've used them when you've had a cold, then they are going to take longer to break down. And they may, if the bin is soupy and has lots of wet food in it, they may actually create little anaerobic pockets. So that's the one caution with adding tissues, is they are clumpy when they've been used, but you may want to be careful about adding them in a huge clump. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting to just do a dive into pathogens in a worm bin. I think I've said it in a previous video, nothing pathogenic comes out of the butt end of a worm. And you know, I thought, well, I need to look into the research on that and just make sure. So I'm just, as you see, I've just pulled back some of the chunky things, and I'm going to put down these tissues here and then feed that moldy food on top. Some of these tissues I've used not only for my personal use, but to wipe up. That's butternut squash soup that I made the other day. I used a tissue to wipe up something I spilled on the table. So yeah, these tissues are pretty clumpy, but I've put them in a single file lineup. Now, if you buy the type of tissues that has highly fragranced or lotions on them, there is a caution to the worms. They may not like it. They may take longer to get into it. If it's the only source of carbon you're using, yeah, that's not a good thing. But if it's not, the worms will go somewhere else until these are broken down long enough. The lotions, which are all biodegradable, by the way, all lotions that are used in tissues. So anything that is on there, any fragrance or lotion, will break down, but the worms might avoid it until the microbes have really gotten into it. Here's just a little bit of moldy food. I'm just going to tip that right over, and then I'll put some squash down. And here's the mold on the butternut squash. You can see the mold growing. Now, I didn't get to this squash in time, like it was sitting out on my kitchen counter, and although it had saran wrap, plastic wrap on it, some fruit flies got in there, so I'm gonna have probably fruit fly eggs on this squash. Some eggshell grit. So with the tissues then, don't worry about the viruses, but do be concerned if you make them super clumpy, that they may form an anaerobic thing if the feeding area is also really sloppy. They tend to get, you know, kind of hold on because those cellulose fibers that are in the tissues are going to swell. So they're made from wood pulp and cellulose, very, very biodegradable, but more difficult for the worms to get into them when they're in a clump. Now, I'm going to give my worms some longer term carbon because you can tell I need to pull this stuff out. This bin is building fast towards a harvest, and these big chunk bits will form the basis of the next bedding cycle, but you know me, I need some leaves. I've got a glove on this hand because I knew I was going to be handling moldy food, and I have a cut on my hand. So there you go. You don't want to get into it. And I guess that's my takeaway message. I'll just wipe this hand with this tissue. The research says that if you process your bin for 2 to 3 months after adding anything that could be fungus that you don't want passed on to the next generation, anything other than powdery mildew, or a bacteria that you think might be unsafe for you or a crop, if you wait 2 to 3 months for adding those to your garden, you will be just fine. Now, if you saw my recent video on how I store my worm castings through the winter, you know that what I'm doing is I'm storing my castings for 2 to 3 months. So that alone is sufficient time. I do not have to wait 2 to 3 months to harvest this bin. I can harvest it, and between now and when I harvest, as well as aging out those castings, is going to be definitely 2 to 3 months before any bacteria that I may have introduced to the bin could possibly be passed on. And I say possible bacteria because, you know, I said I had a virus, but I guess there's a chance it was, well, it wasn't strep throat. I know what strep throat feels like, but if it had been strep throat, for instance, instead of just a throat virus, then, you know, you wouldn't want streptococcus in here and use it right away in your garden. But 2 to 3 months, I think any good worm farmer knows that's perfectly doable without inconveniencing your normal harvest schedule at all. And the worms are going to take care of the bacteria. You don't need to worry about the viruses as long as you have safe handling when the viruses are fresh on those tissues. Obviously, if it's just you, then it's your virus. But safe handling with other members of the family potentially until that maximum 72-hour window has gone by for most viruses, and they are not alive. You don't need to worry about that at all. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.